The first thing I want us to talk about is the very clear difference between consumer podcasts and enterprise podcasts, because we
Yeah.
often hear about consumer podcasts. Those are the ones that are commonly referred to. So,
Yeah.
break down the difference between that for us.
Got it. So let me first talk about B2B podcasts, right? How I or as Ranx, we would go about suggesting that you use B2B podcasts. I think the primary purpose of them needs to be to get access and to engage your key stakeholders, right? Now, these key stakeholders could be customers. These key stakeholders could be strategic partners that you have. These key stakeholders could sometimes be your vendor partners. These key stakeholders could be, government bureaucrats if you deal with them, so on and so forth. However, of all these stakeholders, the one that you often want to access and engage with the most is your customers or your clients, right? In a B2B business. Now, what do we mean by access and what do we mean by engagement, right? So very often when a B2B business is reaching out to customers, they're not that willing to get on meeting calls or VCs, right? For them, it seems like a little bit of an impediment in their day.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if a company ends up inviting a certain person for a podcast, that is something that they're more willing to do because everyone loves a great conversation, right? And so they want to come on that particular podcast, have a great conversation with somebody. And in turn, the invitee or the guest that comes on the show, it's also a matter of prestige for him in some way, status for him, that he's been invited on a podcast and he gets to share his views. And then that person in turn, shares that on his social networks and social media, right? So all of a sudden, you as a brand end up getting access to somebody that was difficult to get access to otherwise, and you have a lovely conversation with him, which becomes the start of a relationship with that particular person, right? So that's new people that you talk to. On the other side, you have your existing customers, right? Now, with your existing customers or clients, how can you use that? This becomes a forum in a way of strengthening your relationship or building on your relationship further with that stakeholder, right? Because more often than not, when you're, typically in the middle of a lot of business discussions, they tend to be very specific, precise to that particular matter. But a podcast is really much broader than that, right? Having a much larger discussion with that particular person, and that ends up strengthening your relationship, building on your relationship further with an existing client, right? So that's where that really helps. And I'll tell you about our experience firsthand, but before that, I'll share a little more about what you can do with your existing clients, right? So
Mm-hmm.
let's assume that you are interacting, a company is interacting with somebody that's not a CXO, but a CXO minus one person, right? In that company that is an existing customer of theirs, and they constantly are dealing with that CXO minus one person.
Mm-hmm.
This could be a great opportunity for you to call the CXO on the show who you don't have access to otherwise with an existing customer that you're dealing with. And then you end up building a great relationship with CXO level people, which is what B2B businesses often want, right? So
Right.
my suggestion, and I think our suggestion to most B2B businesses would be use the podcast primarily to get access and to engage your clients, besides the other advantages that they throw for B2B businesses anyway, which are common with B2C businesses as
Right.
well, right? So
Right.
the
Right.
other four advantages of doing this, like we've mentioned even on our previous podcast, is when you do podcast, you come across as a thought leader. And what a thought leader really means is you come across as an authority or expert on that particular subject.
Mm-hmm.
When you do podcasts, you humanize, you build trust with the customer because they can see the humans behind the brand, right? So that's what ends up happening. Then the people that you call on the show become your brand evangelists or ambassadors in some way, right? That is the fourth
Right.
point of what ends up happening. Of course, all of these are common to both B2B and B2C businesses. And lastly, each you get a lot of fuel for your social media, right? Because today social media is driven by video content, and the beauty of of podcasts is you get video content in long form, which is a video
Yeah.
of 45 minutes to 1 hour for somebody that wants to do a deep dive in that particular subject. So you get that. You get 30-second to 1 minute content, which is your real shorts type of content, and then you get your 5, 6, 10 minute content, which is your clip content, right? So one podcast episode you can really repurpose in so many different ways just on your social media, let alone the other things that you can do with it, right? So tomorrow, if you have a newsletter, you can
Mm-hmm.
share it on your newsletter in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
people that you had on your podcast. Tomorrow, if you have physical stores, you can share it on screens there. Multiple ways in which you can use it, right? But the biggest difference between the two would be the point number one that you shared, right? For
Yeah.
B2B businesses, getting access and engaging with their key customers or stakeholders, I think is the biggest difference, and that's how they should use it, right? Yeah, I don't know whether that
Got it.
answers your
It
question.
does. It does.
Yeah,
It does. So accessing, engaging, and strengthening our relationships with key
yeah,
stakeholders, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
as organizations, that is so important. How often can you,
yeah,
if you're interacting, say, like you said, with the vice president, how often
yeah.
can you say, okay, come, let's just have a
Mm.
30-minute or an hour's chat, or say that, okay, please get the CXO, we'll have a chat, right? But we not only get the opportunity to do that, but then to use it in so many different
Yeah,
ways. Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I
I want to
think,
add a few things to this, Josh.
yes.
Right now that you said this, so we have been in the B2B business forever, right? Of course, my earlier stints have also been part of B2C businesses, but all my entrepreneurial experience has been around B2B businesses. I have over the last 10, 15 years
Mm-hmm.
attended a lot of different forums which are
Mm-hmm.
supposed to give you access and help engage your clients, right? These
Mm-hmm.
forums are typically large conferences that you talk about,
Mm-hmm.
which happen. So I've been invited as a speaker for it, as a guest for it, so
Mm-hmm.
on and so forth. Listen, none of them work, right, in terms of really getting access to people and engaging people. And when I say none of it works, maybe it works sometimes or rarely. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
discount it entirely,
Mm-hmm.
right? But maybe it works sometimes or rarely, because in those big conferences nobody really has time to interact with you in a way, in an intimate way, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
interacting with you. It's just at best something which is a hi,
It's
hello.
shallow
It's a
at its
very
best.
shallow, you're just exchanging cards and that's about it, right? So I have,
Mm-hmm.
from a B2B point of view, I have never seen large conferences working, right? So what works is in a way, the two formats, and that's why we offer that, right? What
Mm.
works is the format of a podcast, or what works is the format of a roundtable podcast, right? So
Right.
which are smaller groups that you call, and when you call smaller groups and interact with those smaller groups, that's a good way of accessing people. That's a good way of engaging and strengthening your relationship with people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, there are very, very few forums where you get this as a B2B business, right?
Mm.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I think both the one-on-one podcast format or the roundtable podcast format, both of them are excellent ways in which you can both access and engage your clients as a B2B business.
Yeah. Yeah. That clears it up, Swapnil.
Mm.